Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. In this video, we're going to be exploring what a multi-party system would mean in the United States. So first, as usual, I'm going to start by outlining the parties. I finally found a way to show people what I meant when I talked about the parties. Now, the political compass isn't perfect, of course, especially this version, but this is essentially what I would perceive as this hypothetical American political spectrum. So I guess we're going to move from left to right, but first we're going to cover what some of the non-party symbols mean. So first off, we have socialism. Now, socialism starts right here in this line. Um, when I say socialism, I mean anything to the left could be considered, like all of this area could be considered some form of socialism or democratic socialism, social democracy. Essentially, it means that you're not using your laissez-faire capitalist policies. Um, Another symbol I have is this, which is the American center. This is what I perceive to be the center of American politics right now. This isn't like 2022 will be a red wave year thing. This is for viewers outside the United States, uh, America is very right wing in terms of its ideology versus what the idea of a Western liberal democracy is. In countries like France, you have socialist candidates winning 25% of the vote, and more right wing candidates winning 25%. Here, you have socialist candidates may be able to win 10-ish, 15% of the vote, and you have right wing or far right candidates winning like 50% of the vote. So yeah, so I guess I'll get into it. We also have the illiberal democracy bubble up here. Basically, anything above that is leaning towards no longer a democracy. Um, Illiberal democracy is a term that Viktor Orban in Hungary uses, which was the erosion of mass media and media independence. Now it's just essentially Hungarian media is Orban's friends and allies and a bunch of oligarchs. Um, and so yeah, so let's get into it. First, we're gonna start with the presidential election, of course. I'm gonna be doing the presidential election, and later on we'll get to the proportional election. Um, so the presidential election essentially is going to work like a normal presidential election. Uh, it's whoever gets the most votes in a certain state wins all the seats. This is going to have a tiny bit of ranked choice voting just because of how my head was working when I tried to outline this. But essentially, this is what the map looks like. So let's break down why some states are where. So first, we start in the West. Undeniably, the West Coast is very, very socially progressive, and they're very concerned about climate change. And so that immediately made me wipe out the entirety of everything to the right of the Greens. However, they're also significantly more moderate. Like, there's not like socialist governors winning primaries outside of maybe some of the major cities. And so that meant they couldn't be democratic socialists. And the big changing point for me, I guess, was the recent primaries, where slightly, I guess you could say the center of the Democratic Party, which I would define to be somewhere between Social Democrat and Greens. And I was leaning towards the Greens already due to climate change. So I decided to put the Greens there. I would like to note, of course, when you look at this, this is a left. The furthest left is the Democratic Socialist. The furthest right is MAGA. Um, some of the parties aren't exactly where you would think. So the Greens are usually thought to be to the left of the Democrats. I think in this scenario where the Democratic Party splits, the Greens absorb some of the more moderate, well-educated suburban vote, just like they have when they became large in other countries such as Germany. I also want to note that Labor has won states like Indiana and Arkansas. I'll get there, but essentially, there's a reason why they're in this order. Next, we come to the Southwest. Now, in the Southwest, this was the region of Barry Goldwater. This was the region of essentially the big Republican revival, especially in the Reagan years. He came from the West. I know he came from California, but the area where he did the best versus previous years was actually here in the Southwest. It's a very libertarian area. Gary Johnson was actually from New Mexico. And I think they're like Colorado has legalized marijuana, but Colorado also allows abortion. So, like, they've got a lot of socially liberal things, but they also allow guns. So they've got some what would be considered socially conservative things. So essentially, they're libertarian. Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, and Alaska also fit in the same basket. Um, Now Utah is special because Utah, for the longest time, would have been thought of as mainstream conservative. It is, of course, the home state of Mitt Romney, but recently Romney has been essentially a maverick in his party, the next John McCain, which essentially shows that the Republican Party has been shifting rightward ever since 2008, or especially since 2012, when Mitt Romney himself lost to Obama when Obama achieved his second term. And therefore, I put Utah on the establishment conservative because Mitt Romney has defeated Donald Trump in polls in a one-on-one in Utah. Now, of course, this is Mitt Romney's home state, but we're only talking about that state. Now, in the Northwest, this is MAGA country. This is Wyoming. This is Idaho. This is South Dakota, North Dakota, and some of Nebraska. I think all of those states are extremely, extremely pro-MAGA. I don't think Liz Cheney wins her primary, however much some people hope so. And even Liz Cheney, she's not like some moderate. Like Liz Cheney is very conservative. She just didn't think that Trump won the election, and that made her no longer part of the MAGA group and part of the mainstream conservative. But she's going to lose, probably. I think there's like a 90% chance. I think Liz Cheney even knows she's going to lose. She's down by a lot in polls. And Montana's special as well, because Montana previously had a Democratic governor. And that made me hesitant to put them in the MAGA group because if Montana had a Democratic governor and still has a Democratic senator who survived through the age of Donald Trump, I think that this has to be at least mainstream conservative because there's enough conservatives saying, yeah, I'll vote for the Democrat. Um, Now, Texas and Oklahoma, essentially the same thing. There's been close races there. Democrats have like Beto O'Rourke. Beto O'Rourke in 2018, he almost beat Ted Cruz. Now, Ted Cruz is an exceptionally weak candidate, and at the time at least, Beto O'Rourke was an incredibly strong candidate. However, Beto O'Rourke, he still didn't even win. So there's no question of it being an establishment conservative state, and especially if the recent GOP platform in Texas I think you have to call it mainstream conservative, if not fully MAGA. And remember, this isn't the center of the state. The center of gravity in Texas. Like if you were to take 50% of the votes and put them on the left and 50% on the right, it probably comes down in the establishment conservative area, maybe even the libertarian era if you were to take this as a left wing versus right wing. Um, but the largest grouping in Texas right now, I think, is mainstream conservative. Next, we come to what I like to call this is the Mississippi states Missouri, Arkansas, Louisiana. They vote extremely right wing in the federal level, but at the state level, they're much more moderate. It's possible that Eric Reitens, for example, loses his the Senate race if he's nominated by the GOP. Louisiana has a Democratic governor, and Arkansas has recently in the past experimented with Democratic governors. I think this entire Labor Party or grouping, I guess, has shifted towards Trump uh, versus the old Republican Party. But that doesn't mean that suddenly these voters disappeared. They aren't saying the election was rigged. Now, there's people nominated in those states who are, but that's because of the primary system, not because of the largest grouping. I think that Labor is most of these votes. Same with the Appalachian states, West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee. Kentucky, I think you can just look at the governor race that the Democrats now control Kentucky's governorship. That tells you it has to be it's very working class there. Working class and white, which is key for the labor grouping. And same for West Virginia. Now, as we get to the Midwest, I want to explain a little bit more about labor because labor is an interesting party. When people hear the Labour Party in Europe, they're mostly thinking of the United Kingdom's Labour Party, which defines itself as a social democratic or democratic socialist or trade unionist party. And it used to have some Greens and even some third way-ish liberal supporters. N- Not in the United States. In the United States, I think the Labor Party or grouping, represents much more of your typical Obama to Trump voter. Most of the time, this is going to be your coal miner, etc., your factory workers. But I also think it includes your farmers. I think that it does include people who are farmers. I think it includes people essentially who just do work, your blue collar workers essentially. And so that's why I think basically the entire Midwest is here because you got farmers in Iowa, you got workers throughout all of here, your industrial, your Rust Belt area. Same in Pennsylvania, my home state. Um, then we go to the South. Now in the South, I've made a controversial decision to put Georgia in the establishment conservative area. And I only do this for one reason, which is that if Georgia was a MAGA state, Brian Kemp does not win his primary. That didn't happen. If Georgia was a mainstream conservative state, Brian Kemp wins his primary with 55% ish of the vote. It's a competitive primary. That did not happen. Brian Kemp got over 70% of the vote. So that means the largest Republican grouping in Georgia has to be at least establishment conservative when you factor in how many Republicans voted for Joe Biden to make it essentially a 50-50 state. And therefore are now registered Democrats, a lot of them. So I would say Georgia is an establishment conservative state. That said, Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, North Carolina, Florida, even though Florida and North Carolina are swing states, all of those, the largest grouping is undoubtedly MAGA. There's not really such a dominant figure in any of them, other than like you've got like DeSantis in Florida. He's undoubtedly the most popular person there, and he's also part of the MAGA grouping. Now we get towards the Northeast, which is essentially the Democrats' heartland in this scenario, or the old Democrats. It's the Liberal Party. The Liberal Party, I think, slightly less economically left wing than Labor, and slightly more socially left wing than Labor. If we go back here, you see the big difference is Liberal is much closer to the center um, in the economic scale, or I guess, than Labor is. But a Labor is essentially the same distance away from the social scale, and Labor is actually right wing on the social scale. Um, and so, yeah, I think that that's essentially how you end up with this scenario. You got your suburban voters in New Jersey, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia. Um, and in northern New England, I think this new Liberal Party also wins. You got Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine. They all have moderate voters, but they also are all old school liberals. Even the Republican Party in Vermont defines itself as a liberal party. The governor calls himself a liberal. So, yeah. In Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, on the other hand, those were not really traditional Republican states. Now, what I mean by that is when Abraham Lincoln was around, all of these states in New England were Republican. When JFK was around, so essentially the next party system in the 60s or so, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island were all Democratic, but the other three were all Republican, which to me says these have more economically liberal voters, which means that they have to be of the Greens, even if they're socially similar. Um, Now coming down to our final two areas, DC, this is a pretty easy one. Social Democrats. DC gets a reputation for being full of some crazy far left people just because they vote 90% for the Democrats. But that doesn't mean that the 90% of people who vote for Democrats are all on the left wing of the Democratic Party. I still think the overall consensus is somewhere between the Social Democrats, the Greens, maybe some Social Democrats or Democratic Socialists, but it's still got a large working class area in DC. Like DC might be rich on the whole, but a large part of the city is still poor. So I think that's something that's overlooked. And then of course New York is Social Democrat, especially when you look at just New York City and Albany and all those areas. So next I come to the proportional map. Essentially, it looks the same. All the toss-up areas mean that there was a tie. So like in North Dakota, there's only 3 votes. So this is essentially how I determined it. I use ranked choice voting if I thought that there'd be a tie, and I essentially used election results from 2020, 2012, or 2020, 2012, 1992, um, and 1960. And those are my four big elections where I thought something major changed. I also use 1968 for the southern states, but for the most part, yeah, ranked choice voting really came in here, which is why you see states like Indiana. I think like in states like Indiana, you have a strong establishment conservative presence. I also think you have a strong labor presence. And that's why this would be tied, I think in certain areas like California, the Greens take it by a relatively large margin, maybe not over the Libertarians, but in our states like Utah, it's pretty clear uh, who is the largest essentially grouping in the area. I do think some things to note. DC, I didn't give them any Democratic Socialists because, of course, you've got your more minority, working class, poor voters. And then, of course, you've got your essentially government workers and then normal left-wingish Democrats. So, yeah, so this is the coalitions. Now, how would a president be chosen? Well, if it was this system, then we would essentially see a coalition of the Social Democrats, Greens together, and Democratic Socialists, although they don't exist in this timeline. And in the other side, we have MAGA, the mainstream conservatives, and establishment conservatives. I do think that in this case, the Social Democrats and Greens also have the liberals, which essentially leaves two swing groupings. You have the Libertarians and you have Labor Party. I think the Libertarians definitely lean more towards the right, especially in economic sense. Um, so therefore, I'd have to say the Libertarians probably join the traditional Republican alliance, which is these four sections. Of course, Trumpism being the largest. In a first past the post or most votes win system. And I think that this is essentially the Democratic Party right here. I do think the Labor Party probably leans Democratic barely. That's why you see states like, whoops, that's why you see states like, Iowa or Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin, PA, all Democratic today and probably will be at least for the next 4 years. Um, I think after that, though, this starts to shift more Republican, um, just because of demographic change. As minority voters leave the cities in the north and go essentially in a second great migration to other areas such as the west in like Arizona. Um, so I think that's your coalition in this winner take all system. I think in the proportional system it's much different. And you can immediately see why. The Labour Party in this simulation is the largest area, and they cover almost slightly over a quarter of the votes or electoral votes. Whereas in this more parliamentary system, they only have 92. They're not even the largest grouping, and they're stuck on the middle of the economically left to right, left wing. So I think in this scenario, you've got your Democratic Socialists like Bernie Sanders, you got your Social Democrats like Warren, you got your Greens, maybe people who are like Kamala Harris, in their views. I think you've got your liberals like Joe Biden, Pete Buttigieg might be in here. Pete Buttigieg could also be in the labor area. Of course, you've got your four Republican areas. And I think that once again, labor is going to determine who wins, which I think tells you enough about why these labor areas are so staunchly turning towards Republicans and also so the swing states. Because Republicans have realized if they can hold the Rust Belt and maintain the Sun Belt, they can have an almost permanent majority by winning the middle of the country. Democrats have realized if they can hold the Rust Belt and take the Sun Belt, then they can hold a majority over essentially the outside of the country, the coast of the country, and some of the more distant from the coast but not as distant areas, mostly around big cities. And I think that's your two competing visions is which one's going to win. We've seen visions like this previously, such as Richard Nixon's Southern strategy, where he realized if he could have the entirety of the West, so everything west of the Mississippi, and if he could get the South, he would have an electoral majority for decades, and he was right. Until, of course, Watergate collapsed that, but for a while it seemed like it was working. Um, we saw, of course, before Nixon, we saw the idea that if you could get the North and the West together, then you would be able to win a majority. And that was true for a while. And now I think we're seeing if you can win the Sun Belt and the Rust Belt, then you could win a majority. I also think the last key thing I'd like to note is that in this scenario, there are zero toss-up votes. Toss-up votes I would have left in there as undecided. I think that in a scenario like this, there are so few undecided voters because voters are not that different from other voters registered with that party. For example, in today, someone supporting Bernie Sanders is part of the same party as someone representing Joe Biden. And those are two radically different politicians. One is, of course, for a literal democratic socialist, and one says that he's a liberal, he doesn't want Medicare for all, etc. And I think the same is true to a lesser degree, of course, in the Republican Party. I think in the Republican Party of today, you have establishment concerns, but they're still quite different from your MAGA Trumpish folks. And I think there's a real gap emerging as liberals lose their strength in the Democratic Party and establishment conservatives lose their strength, and even slowly but surely, the mainstream conservatives towards the MAGA movement of the Republican Party. And that's part of the issue. I think that as the major factions of the old order essentially fall apart, we are getting dragged further and further away. And in my opinion, the only way that this partisanship can be stopped is through a multi-party system. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe.